Welcome. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. For a bit of fun, comment where you're from and what time you're watching this video. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. The path had been demanding, a constant negotiation with tangled roots and uneven terrain. Days blurred into a repetition of aching muscles and the comforting rhythm of boots on earth. We were a small group, drawn by the allure of the remote Canadian wilderness, seeking a solitude that felt increasingly rare. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, we stumbled upon it. A cluster of buildings nestled within a small clearing appeared unexpectedly through the trees. It possessed an air of abandonment, a stillness that spoke of years, perhaps decades, of being untouched. The structures were small, built from timber that had weathered to a uniform grey. Roofs sagged in places, and windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out into the surrounding forest. An unspoken agreement passed between us. This was a place to rest, a respite from the arduous journey. We set about making camp in the centre of the clearing, a small fire our only beacon against the encroaching darkness. The air grew cold as night fell, the silence of the wilderness amplifying the crackle of the flames. Later, as I lay in my sleeping bag, the sound reached me. It was low, resonant, a deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the very ground. It circled our camp, a constant, unsettling presence just beyond the reach of our firelight. The sound possessed a primal quality, something ancient and predatory. The next morning, one of us was gone. His sleeping bag lay empty, his few belongings undisturbed. Tracks led away from the camp, heading into the dense trees. We followed them for a short distance, the prints clear in the soft earth. They were undeniably human, the familiar pattern of boot soles, but then they changed. The impressions became elongated, the stride impossibly wide. The distinct shape of a human foot was no longer discernible. A profound disquiet settled over the remaining group. Another night fell, and the growling returned, closer now. Sleep offered little comfort, filled with vague anxieties and the persistent feeling of being watched. In the morning, another member of our party was missing. The same scenario repeated. An empty sleeping bag, undisturbed belongings, tracks leading into the woods that soon transformed into something else entirely. The remaining tracks conveyed a sense of immense power and an almost unnatural gait. The pattern continued. Each night the growls would encircle our camp, drawing tighter. Each morning another person would be gone, their tracks leading away and then morphing into those disturbing non-human shapes. Fear became a constant companion, a cold knot in my stomach. We huddled together, the dwindling fire our only source of comfort, the surrounding darkness feeling increasingly malevolent. Then there were two. The growls that night were incessant, a chorus of deep, rumbling sounds that seemed to come from all directions at once. I lay awake, every muscle tense, listening to the sounds circling just beyond the edge of the light. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket. The next morning, I was alone. The tracks leading away from my companion's empty sleeping bag followed the now familiar pattern, starting as human and then becoming something else, something monstrous. The silence of the forest was broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. The growls had ceased. Days passed. I remained in the abandoned village, a prisoner of my fear. I rationed the remaining food, each bite a reminder of my isolation. The sun rose and fell, the shadows lengthening and shrinking around the silent buildings. I scanned the tree line constantly, my senses hyper-alert, expecting something. Then they returned. It was gradual at first, a subtle disturbance at the edge of my vision, the flicker of something moving between the trees. As they emerged into the clearing, I recoiled in horror. Their forms were vaguely familiar, the shapes of my missing companions, but twisted, contorted into grotesque parodies of their former selves. Their limbs were elongated, their bodies gaunt and stretched. Their eyes were black, devoid of any light or humanity, filled only with an insatiable hunger. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, their gaits unnatural and disturbing. They made no sound, their approach silent and predatory. They turned towards me, their blackened eyes fixed with a chilling intensity. A hunger that transcended mere physical need radiated from them. They began to advance, their twisted forms moving with a terrifying purpose. The distance between us began to shrink. The silent, abandoned village became the stage for a nightmare I could never have imagined. The snow crunched beneath my boots, each step a stark sound in the profound stillness of the woods. The winter had arrived with an unusual ferocity, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of white weeks ahead of schedule. The locals had spoken of this forest with a reverence bordering on fear, their voices hushed when they mentioned it. They warned against venturing within its boundaries, especially during this severe season, speaking of things that roamed there, things best left undisturbed. I had dismissed their concerns as folklore, the superstitions of people living too close to the wild. The lure of untouched hunting grounds had been too strong to resist. The deeper I went, the more the temperature seemed to drop, an icy grip tightening around me. The trees, skeletal and bare, clawed at the pale sky. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the branches and the rhythmic crunch of my own footsteps. After hours of trekking, I stumbled upon it. A clearing, small and desolate, held the remnants of a long-abandoned campsite. A few weathered logs lay scattered around a cold, dead fire pit. What caught my attention, however, were the bones. Fragments of skeletons scattered amongst the debris, picked clean, gnawed with a savage intensity. They were undoubtedly animal bones, but something about their arrangement, the way they were scattered, sent a sliver of unease through me. The light began to fade, the short winter day drawing to a close. The temperature plummeted further as dusk descended, painting the snow in shades of blue and grey. I decided to make camp near the old fire pit, the faint impression of past warmth offering a small comfort. As darkness enveloped the forest, the silence seemed to intensify, pressing in on me from all sides. Then I noticed it, a subtle disturbance at the edge of the trees, a shift in the deeper blackness beyond the snow-covered clearing. Something was there, just out of sight. I held my breath, straining my eyes in the dim light. A branch snapped, the sound amplified in the stillness. My senses sharpened, every nerve ending on high alert. A moment later I glimpsed it, a shape, tall and gaunt, moving between the trees. Its limbs appeared elongated, reaching, almost skeletal. It moved with a grace that seemed at odds with its size, gliding silently through the undergrowth. My breath hitched in my throat. As it moved into a small patch of moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could see more clearly. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but stretched, distorted. It was impossibly thin, its frame barely concealed beneath a matted dark fur. Its head was long and narrow, the features obscured by shadow, but I could sense the intensity of its gaze. Even in the frigid night air I could see its breath. Plumes of white vapor escaped its unseen mouth with each exhalation, hanging in the still air like ghostly wisps. The sight sent a jolt of primal fear through me, a cold dread that settled deep in my bones. This was not an animal. This was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent. The local warnings flashed through my mind. The hushed voices, the fearful eyes. I'd been foolish to dismiss them. I'd sought solitude, but I'd found something far more sinister. A profound understanding dawned within me, a chilling certainty that I had made a terrible mistake. The gnawed bones in the abandoned campsite were not just animal remains. They were a warning, a testament to the fate of those who had come before. The creature remained at the edge of the trees, its dark form a stark silhouette against the snow. It did not move, but I could feel its presence, its gaze fixed upon me. A sense of utter helplessness washed over me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The forest was vast, the winter unforgiving. It took a step, then another, emerging fully into the clearing. Its form was even more grotesque in the open. Its limbs were impossibly long, its torso thin and emaciated. The darkness obscured its face, but I could feel the intensity of its gaze, a hunger that seemed to pierce through the very air. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the forest. I gripped my rifle, my hands clammy and shaking, but I knew with a chilling certainty that it would be useless. This was not a creature of flesh and blood that could be stopped by a bullet. It began to move towards me, its long, silent strides eating up the distance between us, its breath, visible even in the dead air, puffed out in front of it like a ghostly banner. I could only watch, frozen in terror, as it approached. The realization washed over me, cold and absolute. I was not the hunter here, I was the prey. The Wendigo had found me. The skid happened without warning, a sudden loss of control on the treacherous ice. The world became a blur of white and grey as the car spun, a sickening lurch followed by a jarring impact. Silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the whisper of the wind against the shattered windshield. Miles from civilization, the biting cold seeped into the wrecked vehicle, a stark reminder of my isolation. After a struggle, I managed to pry open the damaged door and stumble out into the knee-deep snow. The landscape stretched out before me, an endless expanse of white under a leaden sky. The road, barely visible beneath the snowdrifts, offered no immediate hope of rescue. My only option was to seek shelter. I trudged through the snow, my body aching from the impact, the cold gnawing at my exposed skin. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and growing desperation. Just as my hope began to dwindle, I saw it. A small, dark shape against the white expanse, a cabin, abandoned, judging by its dilapidated appearance, but shelter nonetheless. The door creaked open, revealing a single, small room. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows. A rusted wood stove stood in one corner, surrounded by a scattering of old newspapers and forgotten odds and ends. It was basic, but it was out of the wind and snow. I cleared a space on the least dusty corner and settled down, shivering despite the relative warmth inside. As darkness deepened, the wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes. I huddled closer to the stove, the silence of the empty cabin amplifying the storm's fury. A sense of unease began to creep in, a primal feeling of being watched, despite my solitude. Driven by a restless anxiety, I rose and peered through one of the windows. The landscape outside was bathed in the eerie glow of the moon, the snow shimmering like a field of diamonds. And then I saw her, standing barefoot in the snow, her familiar silhouette unmistakable. My mother. A wave of disbelief and a sharp pang of grief washed over me. She'd been gone for years. It couldn't be her, yet there she was, her head tilted slightly as if listening. Her arms were outstretched, a silent invitation. I pressed closer to the glass, my breath fogging the cold surface. She began to move, her gait fluid and graceful, despite the deep snow. She took a step, then another, her eyes fixed on the cabin. A sense of profound disorientation gripped me. This was impossible. As she drew nearer, her features became clearer in the moonlight. Her smile widened, but it was not the warm, comforting smile I remembered. This smile stretched too far, revealing rows of teeth that were jagged and rotting like those of a predator. A wave of pure terror washed over me, eclipsing my initial shock and grief. And then her body began to change. It elongated, stretching upwards, her limbs growing impossibly long and thin. Her head tilted back, her neck extending to an unnatural degree. The transformation was grotesque, horrifying to witness. The familiar form of my mother twisted and contorted into something monstrous, something alien. The figure continued to approach the cabin, its elongated limbs moving with an unsettling speed. The moonlight glinted off its sharpened teeth. The outstretched arms now seemed like grasping claws. The horrifying smile remained fixed and predatory. Recognition dawned, cold and sharp as the winter wind. The stories, the legends whispered in hushed tones. They were not just tales. This was it, the Wendigo, and it had taken the form of the one person I would never suspect, the one person whose call I would always answer. It reached the cabin, its towering form casting a long, distorted shape across the snow. It pressed its face against the window, its black eyes, devoid of any warmth or humanity, staring directly into mine. The jagged, rotting teeth were mere inches away. The silent invitation had become a terrifying promise. A scratching sound echoed from the door, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wood. The flimsy lock offered no reassurance. The creature outside remained pressed against the window, its gaze unwavering. The scratching continued, closer now. The thin wooden door began to splinter. The drive had been long, the winding roads taking us deeper into a snow-covered wilderness. The lodge itself was isolated, a rustic structure nestled amongst towering pines. We were a group of friends, eager for a few days away from campus, a winter escape to the quiet solitude of the mountains. Our arrival in the small nearby town had been marked by a subtle but noticeable coolness from the locals. Glances were exchanged, hushed tones followed our inquiries about the lodge. One old man, his face etched with wrinkles and his eyes holding a deep weariness, had offered a cryptic warning. He advised us, without looking directly at us, to not remain at the lodge after the sun had dipped below the horizon. His words carried an air of grave sincerity that for a fleeting moment made the festive atmosphere in our car dissipate. We had brushed it off as local folklore, the superstitions of an isolated community. The lodge was spacious but draughty, the silence inside amplifying the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. We settled in, unpacking our bags and starting a fire in the large stone fireplace. The evening passed uneventfully, filled with laughter and the easy camaraderie of old friends. As night deepened and the fire began to die down, a sound reached us from above, a scraping, scratching noise originating from the roof. It was intermittent at first, a faint disturbance that we initially dismissed as branches being dragged by the wind. But it persisted, growing more insistent, more unsettling. Then came another sound, a sickening creak, like old wood groaning under immense pressure. It seemed to resonate through the very structure of the lodge, followed by a series of pops and snaps that sounded disturbingly like bones shifting. A palpable tension filled the room. We exchanged nervous glances. The earlier joviality completely vanished. One of us, unable to bear the unsettling sounds any longer, decided to step outside. He grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door, assuring us he would just check to see what was causing the commotion. We waited, the silence inside the lodge now broken only by the frantic beating of our own hearts. Time stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The scratching sounds from the roof had ceased, replaced by an unnerving quiet. Our friend had been gone for what felt like too long. A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the darkness outside, abruptly cut short. We rushed to the door, throwing it open to a blast of icy air. The beam of a flashlight lay on the snow-covered ground, illuminating a set of tracks leading towards the dense tree line. The tracks were large, disturbingly so, and they moved with an unnatural stride. Our friend was gone, dragged into the darkness. Sleep was impossible that night. We huddled together in front of the dying fire, fear a tangible presence in the room. The hours crawled by, each rustle of the wind outside sending shivers down our spines. As dawn approached, painting the sky in pale hues of grey and pink, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was our missing friend. Relief washed over us, quickly followed by a wave of something else, something deeply unsettling. He looked different. His eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles. His skin was pale and drawn, stretched taut over his bones. He moved with a jerky, almost puppet-like gait, and there was a hunger in his gaze, an intense, desperate craving that made my blood run cold. He made no sound, but his presence filled the room with a chilling aura. He looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. Then he spoke. The sound that came from his throat was not his voice, it was something else, something hollow and raspy, a distorted imitation. He began to move among us, his eyes never leaving ours. The air in the room grew colder, a bone-chilling draft that seemed to emanate from him. The hunger in his eyes intensified, a desperate need that was both terrifying and incomprehensible. He reached out a gaunt hand, his fingers long and spindly. The realization dawned, a horrifying understanding that settled like ice in my veins. The locals' warnings, the scratching on the roof, the sickening sounds of shifting bones, the tracks in the snow, his changed appearance, that unnatural hunger. The Wendigo walked among us. The journey to the town had been arduous, the snowdrifts making the already remote location feel even more isolated. The reports had been vague, whispers of disappearances filtering out of the small, snow-covered settlement nestled deep in the wilderness. As a journalist, these were the stories that drew me in, the mysteries that demanded answers. The town itself was eerily quiet. A few figures moved along the main street, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind, their faces drawn and pale. When I approached them, asking about the missing people, their reactions were uniform: averted gazes, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a palpable fear that seemed to radiate from them. My questions were met with silence or mumbled responses that offered no real information. Their eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a deep, unsettling dread. It became clear that answers would not be readily given. The townsfolk were either unwilling or unable to speak of what was happening. My only option was to investigate on my own. The disappearances had reportedly occurred in the vast woods surrounding the town. It seemed the most logical place to begin my search. The trees were skeletal and stark against the white landscape, their branches heavy with snow. The silence of the forest was profound, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I ventured deeper, the sense of isolation growing with each step. The air was frigid, biting at my exposed skin. After hours of walking, I stumbled upon a depression in the ground, partially concealed by fallen branches and snow. Curiosity and a growing sense of unease drew me closer. As I cleared away some of the debris, the horrifying reality of what lay beneath became apparent. It was a pit, crudely dug, filled with human remains. Bones, picked clean, lay scattered amongst scraps of torn clothing. Some of the remains looked older, weathered by the elements, but others were disturbingly fresh. The sight sent a wave of nausea and a jolt of cold dread through me. This was no accident. This was a mass grave. A sudden sharp crack echoed through the silent woods, the sound of a branch snapping directly behind me. My blood ran cold, I froze, every muscle tense, my senses on high alert. The profound silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sound itself. Then the stench hit me, a cloying, sickeningly sweet odor of decay carried on the still air. It was overpowering, almost suffocating. Slowly, cautiously, I turned around. Standing amidst the trees, its gaunt form towering over me, was a figure of nightmare. Its frame was skeletal, stretched to an impossible height. Its skin was pale and taut, clinging to its bones. Hollow sockets stared out from its face, devoid of any discernible features save for a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Its hands ended in long, bloodied claws, stained a dark, gruesome red. The source of the stench was undeniable. Its gaze, though seemingly empty, held an ancient, predatory hunger that pierced through me. It did not move, but its presence radiated a malevolence that was both terrifying and absolute. The creature simply stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on me, the blood on its claws glistening in the dim light filtering through the trees. The silence of the forest returned, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. The pit, the missing people, the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying understanding. The Wendigo was still hungry. The snow lay deep, a pristine blanket covering the wilderness. The air was crisp and cold, biting at our exposed skin. My son's excitement was infectious, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the quiet stillness of the forest. We had ventured into a remote area, seeking game in the heart of winter, unaware of the tales the locals whispered about this land. We set up camp as dusk began to settle, the orange glow of the setting sun painting the snow in hues of pink and purple. The small tent offered a meagre shield against the encroaching cold, but the warmth of our shared companionship made the night feel less daunting. We ate a simple meal, the silence punctuated only by the crackling of the small fire we had built and the distant howl of what sounded like a wolf. Later, as I lay nestled in my sleeping bag, a subtle sound penetrated my sleep. A calling, soft and melodic, seemingly coming from just beyond the tent. It was directed, I knew instinctively, at my son, who slept soundly beside me. A prickle of unease ran down my spine, an instinctual alarm bell ringing in the quiet of the night. I drifted back to sleep, dismissing the sound as a trick of the wind or perhaps a nocturnal animal. But the feeling of disquiet remained, a subtle disturbance in the peaceful rhythm of the night. I awoke to a chilling stillness. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint, dancing illumination within the tent. My son's sleeping bag beside me was empty. A surge of panic shot through me. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The tent flap had been ripped open, jagged tears in the fabric revealing the snow-covered ground outside. And then I saw them, the tracks. Leading away from the tent, small human footprints, undoubtedly my son's. But they didn't continue as human prints. After a short distance, they elongated, the stride widening, the shape becoming something else entirely, something monstrous and clawed. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drum against the silence of the woods. I grabbed my rifle, its cold metal a small comfort in my trembling hands. I had to follow him. I had to know what had happened. The tracks were easy to follow in the fresh snow, a disturbing narrative etched onto the white landscape. The transformation in the prints spoke of a terrifying change, a metamorphosis that defied understanding. My breath caught in my throat with each step. A knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The trail led deeper into the trees, the forest growing denser, the shadows longer. The air felt colder here, an almost unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. I scanned the surroundings, my eyes darting from tree to tree, my grip on the rifle tightening. Then I saw him, standing still in a small clearing, his back to me. It was my son. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. "Son?" I called out, my voice hoarse. He didn't respond. He remained motionless, his small figure silhouetted against the snow. A sense of unease crept back in, a feeling that something was profoundly amiss. I approached him cautiously, my rifle raised. "Son, are you all right?" I asked again, my voice barely a whisper. He remained still, his back still turned. I reached out a hand, about to touch his shoulder, when he finally turned. The sight that greeted me sent a wave of pure, unadulterated horror crashing over me. The face that was once my son's was now a grotesque mask. His eyes were vacant, lifeless orbs, devoid of any spark of recognition. His mouth was stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth that seemed too numerous, too predatory. The familiar features were twisted, contorted into something alien and terrifying. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. The legends, the whispers, the fear, it was all real. This was not my son. The Wendigo had taken him. The ascent had been arduous, the thin mountain air making each step a labored effort. The northern peaks were unforgiving, their jagged silhouettes piercing the pale sky. We were a small team, driven by the thrill of discovery, following whispers of ancient sites hidden deep within this rugged terrain. After days of searching, we found it, a narrow opening concealed behind a curtain of frozen vines. The entrance was small, barely large enough to squeeze through, but the darkness beyond beckoned with the promise of the unknown. We exchanged excited glances, the culmination of weeks of planning finally at hand. The passage descended steeply, the air growing colder and damper with each step. Our headlamps cut through the inky blackness, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the cave. Deeper inside, the cavern opened up into a vast chamber. The beam of my light danced across the walls, revealing intricate carvings etched into the stone. The carvings depicted scenes of a horrifying nature. Grotesque figures, tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs, and the heads of beasts were shown devouring human forms. The depictions were visceral, raw, conveying a sense of savage hunger and ancient ritual. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature settled over us as we studied the disturbing artwork. We made camp in the center of the chamber, the flickering light of our lanterns doing little to dispel the oppressive darkness that surrounded us. The carvings seemed to watch us from the walls, their silent narrative a constant source of unease. Sleep came fitfully, filled with unsettling images conjured by the ancient artwork. Morning arrived, casting a weak glow through the cave entrance. One of our team was missing. His sleeping bag lay half unzipped, a dark stain spreading across the fabric. Blood. A cold wave of terror washed over us. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, just the horrifying evidence of a sudden, violent disappearance. Panic seized us. The carvings, the blood, the missing colleague, the implications were terrifying. We had to get out of this place. We packed our gear hastily, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. The narrow passage we had entered through now seemed like a claustrophobic trap. We scrambled through the darkness, our headlamps bouncing erratically. The silence of the cave was broken only by our ragged breathing and the scraping of our boots against the stone. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched by something unseen, was overwhelming. Then the sound reached us from behind, a rapid, scraping noise, echoing through the tunnels. It was getting closer. Whatever had taken our friend was pursuing us. We pushed ourselves harder, our fear lending us a desperate burst of speed. The air grew thick with a nauseating stench, a cloying odour of decay that filled our nostrils and made our stomachs churn. It was coming from behind us, growing stronger with each passing moment. The creature was gaining on us. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, leading us deeper into the labyrinthine cave system. We could hear it now, the sound of its passage echoing in the darkness, a swift, almost gliding motion. It was faster than anything we could have imagined. We stumbled, our legs burning, our lungs screaming for air. The stench of rot was overpowering, a suffocating blanket. We could sense its presence just behind us, a dark, unseen force relentlessly pursuing its prey. There was no escape. The Wendigo had found us in its ancient lair, and it would not let us leave. The darkness ahead offered no solace, only the chilling certainty of what awaited us. The letter arrived unexpectedly, informing me of my uncle's passing and the inheritance of his property, a remote cabin nestled deep in the northern woods. I had not seen my uncle in years, barely remembering him as a solitary figure who preferred the company of the wilderness to that of people. Still, the prospect of owning a cabin, a retreat from the city, held a certain appeal. The drive was long and isolating, the landscape gradually transforming from familiar suburbs to dense forests and winding snow-covered roads. The cabin was even more remote than I had imagined, situated in a small clearing miles from the nearest town. It was a small rustic structure, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a dark grey. An air of neglect hung about the place, the porch sagging slightly, the windows looking dusty and unwelcoming. Inside the cabin was sparsely furnished and cold. A thick layer of dust coated every surface. As I began to explore, I noticed peculiar markings on the wooden walls. Deep gouges, as if made by large claws, marred the surfaces in several places. They were old, the wood around them splintered and darkened with age, but they spoke of something violent, something unsettling. In one corner of the main room, I found a heavy wooden door, bolted shut with a thick chain and padlock. It was the entrance to the cellar, I assumed. The chain looked old and rusted, but the fact that it was secured from the inside sent a shiver of unease down my spine. What could possibly be in the cellar that required such extreme measures? Night fell quickly in the wilderness, plunging the cabin into an inky blackness, punctuated only by the faint glow of the moon through the grimy windows. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, its mournful sound adding to the growing sense of isolation. I settled into the least dusty corner of the living room, a small fire, my only source of comfort and light. Later, as I lay trying to sleep, the sound began. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin. They were distinct, deliberate, the kind of sound made by something substantial moving through the undergrowth. My heart pounded in my chest. I rose cautiously and peered through the window. The ground outside was covered in a thick blanket of fresh snow. There were no tracks, nothing. Just the undisturbed expanse of white under the moonlight. The footsteps continued their circuit around the cabin, the sound somehow amplified by the silence of the night. I pressed my ear against the wooden walls, trying to discern the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A profound sense of dread began to settle over me as the night wore on, and the wind continued its mournful cry. Another sensation assaulted me, a smell, a sickeningly sweet, putrid odor like decaying flesh. It seemed to be seeping up through the floorboards, emanating from the direction of the chained cellar door. The stench grew stronger, permeating the entire cabin, making my stomach churn. I huddled by the dying fire, my senses on high alert, listening to the phantom footsteps circling the cabin and the pervasive odor of carrion, the claw marks on the walls, the chained cellar, the tracks in the snow that weren't there. Disparate pieces of a terrifying puzzle began to fit together. A horrifying realization dawned within me, a cold certainty that chilled me to the bone. My uncle had not simply been a solitary man, he had been guarding something, and now I was here. The Wendigo had been waiting. The wind howled louder, and the scratching began at the door. The call came in just after dawn, a frantic report of an overdue camper. The location was a remote section of the park, an area known for its dense woods and rugged terrain. I gathered my gear, a familiar knot of concern tightening in my stomach. Missing persons cases in this wilderness rarely had happy endings. The hike to the campsite was uneventful, the early morning sun filtering through the trees, casting long dancing light on the snow-covered ground. As I approached the designated area, the scene confirmed my apprehension. The tent lay in tatters, ripped from top to bottom, the fabric shredded as if by enormous claws. Gear was scattered around, a stark testament to a hasty and violent departure. I surveyed the area, my eyes scanning for any sign of the missing camper. Footprints led away from the ravaged campsite, heading deeper into the woods. They were clearly human prints, but they were erratic, suggesting panic or distress. I followed them, my pace quickening as a sense of urgency grew. After a while, as I navigated through a particularly dense patch of trees, I detected a sound. Faint at first, carried on the gentle breeze. a voice calling for help. The tone was desperate, filled with fear and exhaustion, and it sounded familiar. It sounded just like the missing camper, according to the description I'd been given. Hope surged through me, a powerful counterpoint to the dread I had been feeling. I quickened my pace, pushing through the undergrowth, following the sound of the voice. It grew slightly more distinct as I moved, guiding me deeper into the wilderness. The voice led me to a small clearing, a patch of open ground surrounded by towering pines. I scanned the area, my eyes searching for any sign of the camper, but the clearing was empty. The only evidence of recent passage was a set of prints in the snow, but they were not the same as the ones I'd been following. These were larger, deeper, and possessed an alien quality, the shape of the foot disturbingly elongated, the stride impossibly wide. They led directly into the dense trees on the far side of the clearing. Confusion and a growing sense of unease washed over me. Where was the camper, and what had made these other tracks? The voice called out again, the sound clearer now, seemingly closer. It still sounded like the missing person, the same tone of desperate pleading. It seemed to be coming from the direction the unnatural footprints were heading. A cold dread began to creep into my heart, a primal fear that whispered of something ancient and malevolent. The torn tent, the strange tracks, the voice that mirrored the missing campers. The pieces began to form a terrifying picture. The voice called again, the sound echoing through the trees, definitely nearer this time. It was a plea filled with pain and terror. The Wendigo calls for its prey, and I am here. The unnatural tracks led further into the darkening woods. The voice called one last time, so close it felt like it was right beside me. The snow began subtly, a gentle flurry that we initially welcomed. It added a picturesque quality to the already stunning forest, the white flakes clinging to the branches of the evergreens. But the snowfall intensified quickly, the wind picking up, whipping the snow into a blinding swirl. The familiar trail vanished beneath the accumulating layers, and a cold realization dawned. We were lost. Panic began to simmer beneath the surface as daylight faded, the temperature plummeting with the onset of night. We huddled together for warmth, the howling wind our constant companion. As darkness enveloped the forest, a new sound reached us, carried on the biting wind. Whispers, low, guttural sounds that seemed to slither through the trees, unintelligible yet deeply unsettling. They seemed to come from all directions at once, a chorus of unseen voices surrounding us. The night passed in fitful bursts of sleep, punctuated by the relentless wind and those disturbing whispers. Morning brought no respite from the storm. The snow continued to fall, and the dense woods offered no landmarks to guide us. As the day wore on, one of our group, Mark, wandered slightly away from our small huddled circle, hoping to find a break in the trees. He never returned. A frantic search yielded nothing but his discarded backpack and a set of tracks leading away from our makeshift camp. But these were not human tracks. They were massive, deep impressions in the snow, shaped like hooves, far larger than any deer or moose we'd ever encountered. A profound sense of dread settled over the remaining group. As another night descended, the whispers returned, more insistent, seemingly drawing nearer. The trees around us began to groan, not from the wind, but with a different kind of sound, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from within their very core. There was a shifting, a rustling in the branches that wasn't caused by the wind. Something was moving among the trees, something large and unseen. Then we glimpsed it, a figure in the distance, gaunt and impossibly tall, its silhouette stark against the swirling snow. Antlers, massive and branching, rose from its head, their points like skeletal fingers reaching towards the sky. A primal fear gripped us, a terror that transcended logic or reason. One by one we were hunted. A sudden rustle in the undergrowth, a swift, unseen force, and then a chilling silence. The forest became our executioner, the trees themselves seeming to conspire against us. I stumbled upon one of our companions, Sarah, her body twisted into a grotesque form, limbs bent at impossible angles, her face frozen in a silent scream. The sight was seared into my memory, a horrifying testament to the creature that stalked us. The hunt continued relentlessly. Each disappearance was swift, silent, leaving behind only the crunch of unseen footsteps in the snow and the lingering sense of dread. I ran, driven by a desperate instinct to survive, the whispers echoing around me, the groaning of the trees, a constant reminder of the horror that pursued me. Now I am alone. The storm continues, the snow falling relentlessly. The whispers are constant companions, no longer distant but right beside me, just beyond the reach of my sight. The trees around me shift and groan, their branches reaching like skeletal arms. I can feel its presence, a dark, unseen entity circling me, its hunger a palpable thing in the frozen air. I can almost make out the gaunt, antlered figure through the swirling snow, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The transformation I witnessed in my friends. Will I be next? Will I become one of them? The whispers intensify, a chorus of ancient, hungry voices closing in. The winter arrived with a ferocity I had never witnessed. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the fields under a thick blanket of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled day and night, rattling the windows of our small farmhouse. Our meager stores of food dwindled rapidly, each passing day bringing us closer to starvation. Desperation gnawed at us, forcing us to make difficult choices. We began to ration our meals, the portions growing smaller with each passing week. The constant hunger became a gnawing ache, a persistent emptiness that permeated every aspect of our lives. It frayed our nerves, making us irritable and short-tempered. Even the bond between my wife and me, usually a source of strength, began to strain under the relentless pressure. Our son, little Thomas, was the one who suffered the most. His small frame grew thinner, his bright eyes losing their sparkle. He would often look at us with a silent plea, his hunger evident in his every gesture. It tore at my heart, the helplessness of my situation a constant torment. Then, one morning, Thomas was gone. His small bed in the corner of the room was empty, the blankets neatly folded beside it. A frantic search of their house and the immediate surroundings yielded nothing. The snow outside showed no tracks, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Suspicion, dark and insidious, began to fester in my mind. My wife Martha had been acting strangely lately, her eyes holding a distant, haunted look. I accused her, my voice raw with fear and desperation, of hiding something, of knowing more than she let on. She denied it vehemently, her own eyes filled with a terror that mirrored my own, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Days turned into nights, each one a descent further into despair. The hunger grew more intense, the silence in the house broken only by our ragged breathing and the mournful howl of the wind. I continued to search for Thomas, my hope dwindling with each passing hour. One afternoon, drawn by an inexplicable pull, I ventured into the barn. The air inside was cold and damp, the familiar scent of hay and livestock replaced by something else, something sickeningly sweet and metallic. My stomach churned with a sudden wave of nausea. In the far corner, hidden beneath a pile of straw, I found it. A small pale limb, unmistakably human, gnawed clean at the bone. My blood ran cold, a scream caught in my throat. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling in horror. Then I saw her. Martha stood in the shadows near the back of the barn. Her back was to me, but her posture was rigid, her form strangely elongated. As she turned, I recoiled in terror. Her eyes were black as coal, devoid of any white, reflecting no light. Her mouth was stretched wide, wider than humanly possible, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. Her body seemed to shift and contort, the familiar shape twisting into something grotesque and alien. She stood over what remained of our son, a dark stain spreading across the straw beneath his small, broken body. The truth, horrifying and absolute, crashed down upon me. The hunger that had plagued our home was not just the hunger of starvation. A Wendigo had taken root here, in our very midst, and its hunger was far from satisfied. The black eyes fixed on me, and a low, rasping sound emanated from her throat. The journey north was long and isolating, the landscape transforming into a seemingly endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness. The hunting lodge, inherited from an uncle I barely knew, sat nestled deep within this vastness, a small, isolated structure surrounded by towering pines. The previous owner, another distant relative, had vanished without a trace years ago, a mystery that had never been solved. Despite its history, the lodge was surprisingly well maintained. The interior was clean, the furniture dusted, and the fireplace laid with fresh logs. It was as if someone had been residing there recently, tending to the property. A peculiar sensation settled over me, a feeling that I was not entirely alone. As I explored the grounds, I noticed tracks in the snow encircling the lodge. They were unlike any animal tracks I recognized, large and deeply imprinted, with an almost unnatural gait. They circled the perimeter, a constant reminder of an unseen presence just beyond the walls. Night descended quickly, bringing with it a profound silence that was occasionally broken by an eerie sound echoing through the trees. A wail, inhuman and chilling, that sent shivers down my spine. It was a sound that spoke of immense suffering and a primal hunger, a sound that seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. Driven by a growing sense of unease, I began to examine the lodge more thoroughly. In a dusty corner of the attic, I discovered an old, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle and yellowed with age, filled with a spidery script that spoke of the wilderness and its secrets. The entries detailed the experiences of a man who had lived in this lodge generations ago. As I deciphered the faded ink, a terrifying picture began to emerge. The journal spoke of a creature that roamed these woods, a malevolent entity with an insatiable hunger. It described its gaunt appearance, its immense size, and its chilling ability to mimic human voices, luring its prey to their doom. One passage in particular stood out, describing how the creature would imitate the cries of lost travelers, the pleas for help echoing through the night, drawing unsuspecting victims into the darkness. A cold dread washed over me as I read these words. The wails I had been hearing outside my window, the well-kept lodge despite its abandoned history, the strange tracks in the snow, it all coalesced into a horrifying realization. The calls for help that had occasionally pierced the silence of the night were not from lost souls. They were a trap. The Wendigo itself had been living here, tending to the lodge, waiting, and the cries I had mistaken for distress were its way of beckoning me outside. The wind howled, rattling the window panes. A distinct sound reached me from just beyond the glass, a faint, desperate cry for help. It sounded so real, so full of pain. My hand instinctively reached for the doorknob. The journal lay open on the floor beside me, the chilling words about the voice mimicry staring up at me. The cry came again, a little louder this time, seemingly right outside the door. The journey up the mountain had been treacherous, the narrow roads barely visible beneath a thick layer of fresh snow. I had come to this remote, isolated region to research the unsettling number of missing persons cases reported over the years. The abandoned ranger station, a small, sturdy cabin nestled deep in the wilderness, offered a temporary shelter and a base for my investigations. The blizzard descended with sudden fury shortly after my arrival. The wind howled like a banshee, driving the snow against the cabin walls with relentless force. I was effectively trapped, the roads impassable, the outside world completely cut off. Inside the ranger station, the air was frigid despite my efforts to build a fire in the old stove. The cabin was sparsely furnished, but I found a stack of old logbooks left behind by previous rangers. Seeking distraction from the storm raging outside, I began to read. The entries started innocuously enough, detailing routine patrols and wildlife sightings. But as I delved deeper, the tone shifted. Frantic warnings began to appear, scrawled in increasingly desperate handwriting. The ranger wrote of a presence in the woods, something ancient and malevolent, a creature of immense hunger. The name appeared repeatedly, Wendigo. The log spoke of chilling encounters, of unnatural sounds and horrifying visions, culminating in a final, panicked entry before abruptly ceasing. As the blizzard intensified, a new sound joined the howling wind, a scraping, a dragging sound against the wooden walls of the cabin. It circled the perimeter, a constant, unnerving presence just beyond my sight. I pressed my ear against the cold logs, straining to discern the source, but the storm muffled everything else. Days bled into nights. My provisions, never intended for an extended stay, began to dwindle alarmingly. The hunger became a constant companion, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of water could satisfy. Sleep offered little respite, filled with unsettling dreams of gaunt figures moving through snow-covered forests. One morning, as the weak light of dawn filtered through the frosted window, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. The image that stared back was gaunt, unfamiliar. My cheeks appeared sunken, hollowed out. My fingers, resting on the windowsill, seemed elongated, almost spindly. A wave of nausea washed over me. I looked again, my breath fogging the glass. The changes were undeniable. My body felt lighter, yet a strange, unfamiliar strength seemed to be growing within me. The constant hunger had intensified, becoming a ravenous craving, a desperate need that overshadowed everything else. The scraping sound returned, closer now, right outside the window. The wind howled and the cabin creaked under the force of the storm. I looked at my reflection once more. The eyes that stared back were wider, darker. A primal instinct began to stir within me, a hunger that was no longer just for food. The transformation had begun. The missing persons, the warnings in the logs, the creature circling the cabin. I was starving. And soon I would be the hunter. The scraping grew louder, right at the door. The descent into the earth was exhilarating, a plunge into the unknown. Our headlamps cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating the damp, jagged walls of the unexplored cave system. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a faint, earthy scent that soon morphed into something far more unpleasant. We had dismissed the locals' tales as folklore, the fanciful stories of people living in isolated communities, legends of a creature lurking within these caverns, a being of immense hunger and terrifying power. We were scientists, explorers, driven by the pursuit of knowledge, not swayed by superstitious ramblings. As we ventured deeper, the faint, earthy smell was replaced by a nauseating stench, a cloying odor of decay that made our stomachs churn. Our beams of light flickered across the cave walls, occasionally catching glimpses of disturbing remnants. Shreds of fabric, torn and tattered, lay scattered amongst fragments of bone, picked clean with a savage efficiency. A profound disquiet began to settle over our group. Then the echoes began. Faint at first, carried on the still air of the cave. A voice, familiar, my name, whispered from the darkness ahead. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like Sarah, one of our team, but she was right beside me. Another voice echoed, this one calling out for Mark. It was unmistakably his brother Ben, who was part of our expedition. Confusion turned to a chilling apprehension. These were our voices, yet they seemed to emanate from the depths of the unlit tunnels, distorted and somehow wrong. The echoing voices grew more insistent, calling out our names, laced with a tone of desperation that mirrored our growing fear. We huddled together, our lights dancing nervously across the cave walls, trying to pinpoint the source of the unsettling sounds. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the silence. It came from the front of our group, where Liam, our lead climber, had been navigating a narrow passage. The scream was abruptly cut short, followed by a sickening thud that echoed through the cavern. Panic erupted. We scrambled backwards, our lights frantically searching for Liam. The passage ahead was empty, but the beam of my lamp caught a glimpse of something disappearing into a dark crevice below. A flash of movement, a dragging sound, and then nothing. We had to get out. We turned to retrace our steps, our initial excitement replaced by a desperate urge to escape this subterranean nightmare. But the tunnels seemed different now, the familiar paths. Twisted and altered, rocks had shifted, blocking the way we had come. The cave system, once an intriguing labyrinth, had become a suffocating trap. The echoing voices continued, now tinged with a mocking quality, laced with a hunger that was both terrifying and palpable. We were lost in the darkness, our lights the only barrier against the unseen. The stench of decay was overwhelming, clinging to the damp air. We could sense a presence in the darkness with us, something vast and ancient, its hunger a tangible force. The legends were not folklore. The Wendigo was here, in the dark with us, and it was starving. The echoes of our names grew louder, surrounding us, closing in. The village was a desolate cluster of snow-covered buildings huddled against the relentless onslaught of the winter. The lake, usually the lifeblood of this remote community, was now a vast expanse of frozen white, a silent testament to the season's brutal grip. The disappearances had begun subtly, one or two at first, dismissed as unfortunate accidents in the harsh conditions. But as the weeks passed, the numbers grew, leaving a palpable sense of terror hanging over the remaining residents. I arrived as an outsider, an investigator seeking answers where the locals offered only fearful whispers and averted gazes. The silence of the village was broken only by the howling wind and the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. The houses seemed to huddle together for warmth, their windows like vacant eyes, staring out at the unforgiving landscape. My inquiries were met with a wall of fear and suspicion. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously towards the frozen lake. They offered no logical explanations, only vague allusions to an ancient curse, a malevolent presence beneath the ice. Undeterred, I began my own investigation. The frozen lake became my focus. Its vast, seemingly solid surface held an unsettling stillness. I noticed patterns in the disappearances, most occurring near the center of the lake or close to areas where the ice appeared thinner, marked by dark fissures snaking across the white expanse. Following a hunch, I examined the shoreline, searching for any unusual formations or openings. After hours of searching, partially concealed by snowdrifts, I found it. A small, almost imperceptible entrance to what appeared to be a tunnel leading beneath the ice. The air emanating from it was frigid, carrying a faint, musty odor of something ancient and undisturbed. Venturing inside, I discovered a network of tunnels carved into the ice itself, a subterranean world hidden beneath the frozen surface. The tunnels were dark and narrow, the ice walls glistening under the beam of my flashlight. Deeper within, I found evidence of something else, something old and powerful. Strange carvings adorned the ice walls, depicting gaunt figures with elongated limbs and the heads of beasts. Back in the village, I encountered one of the few remaining residents, a man huddled in his cabin, his eyes wide with a frantic terror. He spoke in disjointed sentences, his words tumbling out in a rush. He raved about something beneath the ice, a creature of immense hunger, a Wendigo that lurked in the tunnels, waiting for the ice to crack, pulling its victims down into the frozen depths. His rantings, initially dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by fear, now echoed the unsettling discoveries I had made beneath the lake, the tunnels, the ancient carvings, the pattern of disappearances near the fissures in the ice. It all pointed to something sinister dwelling below. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a need for answers, I returned to the frozen lake. The wind howled across the vast expanse, whipping the snow into swirling patterns. I approached one of the larger fissures, a dark line snaking across the otherwise unbroken white surface. The ice around it looked thin and brittle. I knelt down, peering into the darkness of the crack, my breath misting in the frigid air. The darkness seemed to stretch down endlessly. I leaned a little closer, trying to see if there was any sign of the tunnels the survivor had spoken of. Suddenly, a rapid scraping sound echoed from within the fissure. Before I could react, something shot upwards with terrifying speed. Skeletal fingers, long and spindly, their tips black and sharp, erupted from the darkness, grasping at the air. One of them brushed against my hand, the touch icy and strangely brittle. I recoiled in horror, stumbling backwards across the frozen surface. The fingers retreated back into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. The fissure remained, a dark gash in the white expanse. The Wendigo was real, and I had stepped too close. The ice beneath my feet creaked. The forest was silent, the only sound the rhythmic thud of our shovels against the frozen earth. We were a team of archaeologists, driven by the thrill of uncovering the past, and today our persistence had paid off. We had unearthed an ancient burial site, undisturbed for centuries, hidden deep within the northern woods. The initial finds were fascinating, fragments of pottery, worn tools, and the skeletal remains of those long gone. But it was the final discovery that sent a ripple of something beyond excitement through our small group. A carved wooden mask. It was unlike anything we had ever seen, crafted with intricate detail, its hollowed eyes seeming to pierce through us, even in the dim light of our lanterns. We carefully brushed away the remaining soil, revealing the mask in its entirety. It depicted a face both human and bestial, with elongated features and sharp-pointed teeth carved into a permanent, chilling grin. There was an unsettling aura about it, a sense of ancient power that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. That night we made camp near the burial site, a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. We prepared our evening meal, the familiar aroma of cooking food, usually a comforting presence in the wilderness. But something was different. The food smelled stale. Upon closer inspection, we were met with a horrifying sight. Our rations, carefully packed and preserved, had rotted. Meat turned black and putrid, vegetables reduced to a slimy mush. Even our sealed containers of dried goods were contaminated. It was as if a wave of instant decay had swept through our camp. Panic began to set in. We were miles from civilization, our food supply inexplicably ruined. Hunger gnawed at our stomachs, a relentless emptiness that grew with each passing hour. The lack of sustenance began to take its toll, our bodies weakening, our minds becoming clouded and irritable. As the days passed, the hunger intensified, becoming a primal, all-consuming need. Camaraderie that had once bound our team together began to fray, replaced by suspicion and resentment. We eyed each other with a newfound intensity, the shared deprivation twisting our perceptions. The change was gradual at first, subtle shifts in behavior, a sharper tone of voice, a lingering gaze that felt predatory. But it escalated quickly. The hunger became a driving force, overriding reason and morality. Accusations flew, fueled by desperation and the gnawing emptiness within. One morning I awoke to find one of our team members missing. His sleeping bag was empty, a patch of disturbed earth nearby the only sign of his departure. Fear mixed with a horrifying understanding. The hunger was no longer just physical, it had become something else, something darker, something insatiable. The remaining members of our group grew increasingly paranoid, huddling together for safety, yet constantly suspicious of one another. Sleep offered no escape, haunted by vivid nightmares of gaunt figures and gnawing teeth. The lines between us blurred, the shared ordeal stripping away our humanity. Then it began, the inevitable descent into madness. A scuffle over a meager scrap of food, a sudden outburst of violence, a look in someone's eyes that reflected a hunger I had never witnessed before. The mask with its hollowed gaze seemed to watch us, its chilling grin widening in the flickering firelight. The days that followed were a blur of terror and desperation. The forest, once a place of scientific inquiry, became a hunting ground. The sounds of struggle echoed through the trees, followed by an unnerving silence. One by one my colleagues succumbed to the insatiable hunger, their humanity consumed by a primal need. Time lost all meaning. My own body grew gaunt, my limbs thin and weak, yet the hunger within me raged, a burning emptiness that could not be quenched. I stumbled through the woods, driven by an instinct I no longer understood. The image of the carved wooden mask burned into my mind. Eventually, the sounds of the outside world broke through the haze of my delirium. The distant whir of a helicopter, the shouts of unfamiliar voices. Rescue teams had arrived. But by then, it was too late. The scene they discovered was one of utter horror. The ancient burial site, now desecrated. The abandoned campsite, littered with gnawed bones. And in the center of it all, the carved wooden mask, its hollowed eyes staring blankly at the sky, surrounded by the gruesome remains of those who had unearthed it. The landscape was a desolate expanse of ash and charred trees, the air still thick with the acrid smell of smoke. The wildfire had swept through this section of the forest with terrifying speed, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Our team had been dispatched to search for any remaining survivors, drawn by faint, intermittent signals that our equipment had picked up, signals that sounded more like cries of anguish than standard emergency beacons. The silence of the burnt forest was unnerving, broken only by the crackling of embers and the occasional gust of wind that sent plumes of ash swirling into the grey sky. We moved cautiously through the debris, our boots crunching on the blackened ground. The heat still radiating from the scorched earth. After hours of searching, we found him, huddled beneath a partially collapsed tree. He was the only sign of life in the vast wasteland. His appearance was disturbing. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes wide and vacant, and his fingers were blackened, as if burned from the inside out. He was alive, but barely. He made no sound as we approached, his gaze fixed on something unseen beyond the smoke-filled horizon. When we offered him water, he recoiled, shaking his head vehemently. He then began to gesture wildly, his blackened fingers pointing towards the deeper parts of the burnt forest. His frantic gestures and wide, terrified eyes conveyed a message more potent than any spoken words. He seemed to be warning us about something that the fire had unleashed. He pointed downwards, then mimed a rising motion with his hands, his expression one of pure horror. As we tried to understand his silent warnings, a presence became apparent, a subtle shift in the air, a feeling of being watched by something immense and unseen. The very atmosphere seemed to vibrate with an ancient, malevolent energy. Then, through the lingering smoke, we saw it. A gaunt figure, impossibly tall, its form distorted by the heat haze. Its eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through the smoke, fixing on us with an intensity that sent a chill down our spines despite the heat of the fire. It stood motionless, a silent, terrifying sentinel in the ravaged landscape. The survivors' frantic gestures suddenly made sense. The fire had not only destroyed the forest, it had unearthed something that had been buried for a reason, something ancient and hungry. The hollow gaze of the creature seemed to confirm his silent warning. Dawn began to break, casting a pale, eerie light across the devastated land. The smoke still billowed in places, obscuring parts of the forest, but the gaunt figure remained visible, its dark silhouette stark against the lightening sky. The fire might have consumed the trees, turned the earth to ash, but the creature remained. Its hollow gaze swept across us, a silent promise of future hunts. The danger was far from over. The Wendigo was loose, and the next feast was only a matter of time. The forest had become a labyrinth of snow-laden trees, every direction looking the same. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the biting cold had seeped into my bones. My hope of finding my way back to camp dwindled with each passing hour. Exhaustion gnawed at me almost as fiercely as the hunger. Then, through the dense trees, I saw it, a faint glow, and as I stumbled closer, the welcome sight of a small cabin, smoke curling steadily from its chimney. A surge of relief washed over me. Shelter, warmth, perhaps even food. The door creaked open easily as I pushed it inward. The interior was small but cozy, a single room with a crackling fire in the hearth. A table in the center of the room was set with a meal, a steaming bowl of stew, a hunk of bread, and a plate piled high with roasted meat. The aroma was rich and savory, almost overwhelming in my famished state. Without hesitation, I approached the table. The meat looked succulent, dark, and glistening. My stomach growled in anticipation. I picked up a piece and devoured it. The taste was intense, almost too rich, but my hunger overpowered any lingering caution. I ate quickly, tearing off chunks of the flavorful meat, savoring the warmth spreading through my body. As I ate, my gaze drifted around the cabin. That's when I noticed them. The walls lined with bones, not just animal bones, but fragments that were disturbingly human in shape. Skulls, ribs, fingers, all picked clean, gnawed with a savage intensity. And interspersed among the bones were deep gouges in the wood, long, sharp marks that could only have been made by claws. A cold dread began to creep into me, a chilling realization that this was no ordinary cabin. The rich taste of the meat suddenly turned cloying in my mouth. I looked at the remaining food on my plate with a newfound revulsion. Just as the thought formed in my mind to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the cabin into deeper shadow. The sound echoed through the small space, followed by another sound, a chilling vocalization that seemed to reverberate through the very air. It was a sound of triumph, of dark amusement, laughter, but not human laughter, something else, something ancient and predatory. The sounds seemed to encircle me, coming from everywhere at once. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, the remnants of the meal turning to lead in my stomach. The bones on the walls seemed to leer at me in the firelight. The claw marks appeared to deepen, becoming more menacing. I had not found a safe haven from the storm. I had stumbled directly into the lair of something monstrous. The laughter echoed again, closer now, right outside the door. The call came in just after sunrise, a report of an empty campsite, a family of 4, gone without a trace. I reached the location quickly, the morning air still carrying a chill. The tent stood forlornly, its entrance flapping in the gentle breeze. Gear lay scattered around, a half-packed suitcase, a child's discarded toy. It looked as if they had simply vanished mid-activity. My gaze fell upon the tracks leading away from the site, clear human footprints, the sizes indicating adults and children. I followed them, my boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. The trail led deeper into the woods, away from the marked paths. After a while I noticed a change. The footprints became elongated, the impressions losing their familiar human shape. Distinct claw marks began to appear alongside them, digging deep into the earth. A sense of unease settled over me. This was beyond a simple case of a lost family. The deeper I ventured, the more profound the silence became. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, were absent. It was an unnatural quiet, broken only by the occasional distant snap of a twig, as if something large was moving just out of sight. The transformed tracks continued their winding path, leading me further into the dense woodland. The trees grew taller here, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The forest floor was damp and dark, the air heavy and still. Then I saw it, a large, ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. Near its base was a hollow, a dark opening in the wood. Curiosity and a growing sense of dread drew me closer. I peered inside. The hollow was filled with bones, small bones, large bones, all picked clean, human bones. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. The tracks, the silence, the bones. It all pointed to something terrifying. I turned to retrace my steps, to head back to the campsite, to call for backup. But the way back no longer seemed familiar. The trees looked different, the undergrowth denser. I tried to orient myself, to find the path I had followed in, but the forest seemed to have shifted, the familiar landmarks gone. Panic began to set in. I was lost. The distant snap of a twig echoed through the silent woods, this time closer. I spun around, my senses on high alert. There was nothing there, just the trees, the shadows, and the oppressive silence. The tracks. I had been following the tracks, but they hadn't been left by the missing family. They had been leading me, guiding me deeper and deeper into the forest, until escape was no longer an option. The unnatural silence pressed in on me, amplifying the frantic beating of my own heart. Another twig snapped, very close now. I scanned the trees, a profound sense of dread washing over me. I was not alone. The town was shrouded in an unnatural stillness when I arrived. The faces I encountered were gaunt, their eyes hollow, reflecting a profound and inexplicable hunger. They moved with a listless energy, their frames alarmingly thin despite the ample supplies in their pantries, according to what little information I could gather. The local clinic was overwhelmed, the few remaining healthy residents struggling to care for the rapidly declining population. My initial examinations yielded nothing conclusive. There were no common pathogens, no nutritional deficiencies that could account for the extreme emaciation. The afflicted ate constantly, voraciously, yet their bodies continued to waste away. It was as if they were consuming, without being nourished, their hunger and insatiable void. As days turned into nights, I observed other disturbing patterns. The ill began to shun daylight, drawing curtains and remaining indoors even when the sun shone brightly. They developed a strange aversion to open spaces, preferring the confinement of their darkened homes. And then there was the whispering, a low, constant murmur that seemed to emanate from the depths of their throats. It was a language I did not recognize, ancient and guttural, a series of clicks and rasps that sounded profoundly unsettling. One evening, as the last vestiges of sunlight faded from the sky, I noticed one of my patients, a young man named Elias, slipping out of his house. He moved with an almost furtive quality, his gaunt frame hunched over, his eyes darting nervously. Curiosity and a growing sense of dread compelled me to follow him. He walked with a surprising speed, his thin legs carrying him swiftly through the deserted streets and towards the edge of town, where the woods began. I kept a discreet distance, my footsteps muffled by the soft earth. He ventured deeper into the trees, the darkness swallowing his frail form. The forest was silent, the only sounds the rustling of leaves underfoot and the distant hoot of an owl. I continued to track Elias, guided by the occasional snap of a twig or the faint sound of his hurried passage. After what felt like a long time, I noticed a faint light filtering through the trees ahead. As I approached cautiously, the scene that unfolded before me sent a wave of nausea and horror crashing through me. In a small clearing, bathed in the eerie glow of the moon, stood a group of figures. They were hunched over something on the ground, their forms emaciated, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were feasting. The object of their attention was a mass of raw, bloody flesh, unrecognizable as any specific animal. They tore at it with their bare hands, their hunger a palpable force in the night air. The low whispering I had observed in town was amplified here, a chorus of ancient, guttural sounds accompanying their gruesome meal. Suddenly one of the figures looked up, then another, and another. Their heads turned in unison, their attention fixed on me. The moonlight illuminated their faces, and the sight was beyond anything I could have imagined. Their teeth were no longer human. They were jagged, elongated like those of a predator. Their eyes were sunken, black pits that seemed to absorb all light, filled with an insatiable primal hunger. The transformation was complete. The illness was not an illness at all. The ancient curse had taken hold. The Wendigo had spread, and now they had seen me.